Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to discuss some stuff that has been coming up about the new book that Bob Iger has put out, which basically chronicles his time as a CEO at the Walt Disney Company. And there's been a number of stories that have come out about this. I'm going to kind of conglomerate them into basically one. Kind of like one encompassing video for right now, at least the major ones are the ones that are very recently pertinent. So here's the thing. Let's start off with Star Wars because that has more information on it at this point. And he chronicles a lot of the stuff involving basically from the time of the sale of Star Wars from George Lucas to the Walt Disney Company, which happened in 2012. All the way up through basically kind of like around The Last Jedi. They haven't really, there's nothing really terribly recent. But basically, the two major points are 2012 and 2015, which is when The Force Awakens was released. And the first thing is that they basically ass-reamed George Lucas in this deal. They ripped this franchise, even though they gave him a very, very big price tag with $4 billion that they paid him for the Star Wars franchise and for Lucasfilm. There is... They basically made it so that he could never have any kind of involvement in Star Wars as a franchise again. One of the stipulations of the deal, which was not technically made public, was that Lucas relinquished all creative rights to the franchise. He could have absolutely any input that he had would be purely as, basically as if we like it, we might think about it. Which, again, a lot of people kind of realized that when it was sold, but it's interesting to just kind of hear it clarified. And this entire thing, really, by Bob Iger is kind of very interesting just because usually when it comes to business, you don't necessarily, a lot of people will, they'll cite certain things like strategies and how to do this and how to do that. This is really less of a strategy and more of a, I don't want to say a tell-all because I don't think it really is a tell-all, but it has a lot of intricacies to these things that I don't think really needed to be there, and it's kind of interesting releasing it into the public and looking at all this stuff in hindsight. Again, hindsight in a lot of cases is 2020, but this is just a completely strange thing to see come out, especially at this point in time, right before Episode 9 is going to come out. That comes out in December. And just to kind of see these various things, again, a lot of people still, a lot of people gravitated back to, George Lucas era Star Wars after Last Jedi came out because it was so bad. And a lot of people did not really, and a lot of people were trying to boycott Disney to get the franchise tanked and get it back to Lucas, which in reality would never happen. But seeing as how a lot of people are championing Lucas at this point, this is kind of interesting. This gives those people a lot of ammo, which is very strange. So, obviously Lucas, there's been a lot of public things. Obviously, he made the public statement about, selling his baby to the white slavers and, stuff like that with Disney. And that's really kind of like, that deal in 2012, essentially it severed all ties. There was nothing left for Lucas after that in terms of creative input. And I know there was stuff, he visited the Rogue One set. Apparently when he visited the Rogue One set, he had no creative input. He was just, chatting it up with Gareth Edwards, the director, and talking about various things about film, just idle banter, nothing involving really his advice on the film. And apparently he also really did like Rogue One, which I don't blame him. I actually enjoyed that movie too. But basically they just cut him off. Now, the other thing that was interesting was that apparently Kathleen Kennedy obviously George Lucas was at the premiere of Force Awakens in 2015, and apparently, and this was not made public, Kathleen Kennedy apparently reported to Bob Iger that George Lucas hated that film. He thought it was complete trash. And his reasoning for it was that he basically turned to Kathleen Kennedy and said, "You have done nothing new. which again is one of the main complaints of that film, is that it's basically a retread of A New Hope in many ways, and environments, plots, the plot of the film, the various characters and stuff that are put into it. A lot of them are very cookie cutter representations of that original film, and some of them are just blatant copies. And George Lucas had a major problem with that. He said, every time I ever made one of these movies, I always tried to to show the audience something new. And that's really what a director should do. And here's the thing, is that a lot of people like to criticize George Lucas for, his films, especially the prequel trilogy and stuff like that, and his later works. But he knows he's a good storyteller. The problem is he needs somebody else to write his dialogue for him, or at least somebody else to tweak it after the fact. But aside from that, he's a very good narrative storyteller. He knows how to hit those points. Even with, like I've said before, even with the prequel trilogy, most of the complaints I have about that stuff is really with the acting and the dialogue. If the dialogue was better, and maybe if the acting was a little better in some of the scenes, then I think those movies would be viewed in a lot different of a light, because I think that they work in terms of a full narrative. But that was his main complaint with that. And, he's had some questionable comments about Last Jedi. Basically, he thought it was a beautiful film. In other words, it's basically played on that he thinks it looked very good, but the narrative was crap. He hasn't had really a quote on that, but that's what a lot of people attribute that quote to. Disney likes to say, "Oh, he loved this film." It's like, maybe not. So it's kind of a split decision. Bob Iger also admits in this that he rushed the Star Wars franchise and put out too many movies at once. Again, this is something that I've harped on before about quantity versus quality, and if you put out a large quantity of films that are good quality, that people will go see, then you have done nothing wrong, and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I don't think Star Wars... I think you could have done a Star Wars movie every year if you really wanted to. You could have done a main movie every other year, and then the in-between years you would do the spin-offs. I think they started off very good with that, even though I don't really care that much for Force Awakens, it still made a lot of money, and it revitalized Star Wars at the time. And then Rogue One, I actually think was a good movie, and then you faltered off with Last Jedi and Solo. And I think because Disney did not listen to what the fans actually wanted and didn't really understand or bother to understand the proper way to kind of carry that narrative forward, or whether or not they should have been carrying it forward, then that's what eventually led to the collapse of Star Wars overall, as opposed to what people are attributing, what Disney attributes it to, which is too much too fast. And again, a lot of people agree with that argument. I personally don't. I think it's quality rather than quantity that is the problem in most of these cases. If you put out a large mass of films that are very good quality, they will make money, they will be good. And generally, as long as they're not, as long as they're not cookie cutter versions of each other, then they should garner a good audience, and they should be well reviewed films. But again, that's an argument to make for another day. But just to say the trials and tribulations, and to air out the stuff that Lucas said, from what we understand, it was said in private, because that was never released to the public, exactly what he said about that. And I'm sure Disney probably wanted it that way, especially at the time. And airing it out now, again, it's basically a moot point, because Force Awakens came out in 2015. It's made the money it's going to make, as has Last Jedi and all those other films. But Rise of Skywalker is coming out in a few months, and you're airing it out that Lucas hated, legitimately did not like the first entry in this series, and was lukewarm on the second. So now you're going into this third one where people know that he doesn't care at all about this series of movies that you've made with his previous product that he created. So it feels kind of dumb to do that from from a CEO perspective, because the only thing you're doing is you're damaging the PR for this film, which, by the way, is not getting a hell of a lot of traction right now anyway. I don't know what Disney's expectations are for this movie, but I don't see it. I see it maybe breaking the $1 billion mark if it's lucky. And I'll probably do a Will It Fail on Rise of Skywalker in maybe like a month or so. But that kind of covers the Star Wars stuff, which again, it's very it's almost damning in the eyes of Disney of what they did to George Lucas in terms of just cutting him out completely. And I mean, we've had reports too of like they ignored all of his story drafts for episodes 7, 8, and 9. They basically they gutted the entire thing. They destroyed the expanded universe, but as soon as they got a hold of it, there's been a lot of very bad things that Disney has done to the Star Wars franchise since acquiring it in 2012. So now let's move over. There was a bit of a tidbit of news that was very interesting that came out that was published today that was from the book where Bob Iger talks about Kevin Feige and how Kevin Feige almost quit Marvel before 2015 because of clashes with his former superior. And here's the thing, is that the real meat of this is very interesting. And so basically Bob Iger, before Kevin Feige was promoted in 2015 to basically run the entirety of the MCU without any kind of he had to report to Disney. He didn't have to report to anybody at Marvel. So he was basically, the MCU was kind of separated, or Marvel Studios in general was kind of separated from the comics division and the rest of the company. And Kevin Feige, before 2015, had to report to a man named Ike Perlmutter. And Ike Perlmutter was the entertainment chairman for Marvel. And basically, he was just Kevin Feige's boss and a few other high-ranking people in the company. And the thing is Perlmutter was somebody who was skeptical about bringing certain superheroes into the limelight. More specifically, Black Panther and Captain Marvel. He did not think that they had, basically, what Iger states is that he did not have he didn't think they had bankability in them, as opposed to the mainstay heroes that they did have. Now, what's interesting about this is that Iger and Feige both shared the same sentiment, that they believed that the MCU could be expanded and those characters could be included. And we also know that Kevin Feige has done his virtue signaling, and we know that as we've progressed further down this path, those the diversity heroes have increased to the ones that are not really popular in the comics. At least Black Panther was popular in the comics, and the movie was actually pretty good. I liked the movie, even though it did have its problems. Again, I did enjoy it. But Captain Marvel, on the other hand, I think is the first real MCU bad film, even though it broke $1 billion. And I find what's interesting is Iger doesn't mention everything that they did to set up Captain Marvel to make the money that it made. And as far as a business decision or a financial decision, what they did with Captain Marvel, if that movie didn't break $1 billion, I think it would have been considered a failure, because everything that they did for that film to make it succeed. Again, they kind of did the same thing with Black Panther, where they aired Black Panther before Infinity War came out, and everybody thought, okay, we're going to go see Black Panther, and we're going to see a bunch of stuff about Infinity War, and there was a little bit in the post-credit scene, but as far as Captain Marvel goes, you put it right before Endgame, which was so much more anticipated than Infinity War, and again, it showed because it made over $700 million more than Infinity War did. And people thought they were going to get some kind of a glimpse at Endgame, and people thought that, oh, she's going to factor into this in like a big way because this is the first MCU movie that she's coming into after her solo film, technically. So there was a lot of anticipation there, and that movie was basically set up to make that. In addition to the fact it also came out in March, it did not have a whole lot of competition. The only competition it really had was Alita Battle Angel, and it blew that out of the water. Again, I feel mainly because of the MCU and Marvel brand. I think if you put out a Captain Marvel movie and you didn't have the MCU backing it, if you didn't have the time frame where it came out, then you wouldn't have had as successful of a film as they did. Instead, you probably would have been looking at modest numbers. I think you would have been probably looking at solo numbers, which means you probably would have lost money technically. But it's interesting to kind of see this, because now they're saying that basically Perlmutter was kind of holding Fahey back. At least that's how this is being framed. And the reason why Fahey was going to quit is because he kept trying to push all these characters, and Perlmutter basically said, they're not bankable. We're not going to do this. We're going to use our mainstay characters, and we're going to try to expand the mainstay characters. And I don't think that's a bad business decision. And I think, again, I feel like because of the way they framed Captain Marvel and Black Panther, that's why those films made the money they did. If they were not framed in those lights, or if they were not framed in those ways, if they were not released in those time frames, and if they were not released concurrently before those big films were to come out, they wouldn't have done as well, in addition to the MCU brand, which probably gave them at least $100 million or so. So there's a lot that they don't go into here. And again, I think that may be just Bob Iger just kind of glazing over these things. Now, I haven't read the book, although given all the information that's in it, I might have to at this point, just because of all the stuff that's coming out on this on various articles. But they need to... this gives a very, very bad light on Disney on what they've done to basically their two big franchises, which is Star Wars and Marvel. And it sheds a light on how much Bob Iger actually does not give a shit about the actual quality of his products. He only really cares about the financial end of it, which he's a CEO. That's really his job, is to care about the financial end of it. I get that. But when you're with somebody like Kevin Feige, you need to make sure there's creative people below you to balance that out. Kevin Feige, I don't necessarily think is a creative individual. I think he's an organized individual. I think he should be a CEO. I don't think he should be necessarily running the show at Marvel Comics, at least at this point. I think he's done his job there, and I think he needs to be moved up to somewhere else and be replaced with somebody who's a bit more creatively minded, and who understands what made various comics sell and what didn't. And I think that needs to be especially examined now that they have X-Men and Fantastic Four moving forward, as well as some of these other properties that they're pushing that still have a chance, as opposed to the Miss Marvels and the Kate Bishops and the female Thors and all that shit. So this will be interesting looking at moving forward, but those are just a few little snippets. The book itself, I believe, is available at major outlets. If anybody wants to actually look at what is going on and read the book for yourself, you can go pick it up at probably Amazon or any other major book outlet. But those are just my opinions on some of these news leaks, or not news leaks, but some of the information that's come out of Bob Iger's book. And it sheds a very interesting light on a lot of the things we've seen in the past. So I'd like to know your opinion. Do you agree with Bob Iger's stance on these things? Do you think that this is just another horrible mark on the Disney brand moving forward, as well as its subsidies like Star Wars and Marvel? Or do you think that Bob Iger made the correct decisions moving forward with these companies? Put your thoughts in the comments. Again, I like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?